Hi. All right, let's talk about a little bit about human evolution. This is a huge topic, and we could easily have a full semester course just on human evolution. So we're just going to hit the highlights. So, if we are going to explain how humans evolved using only natural selection and the theory of evolution, we have a lot of weird traits that would need a hypothesis for how these things could have evolved. And we'll talk about a lot of these. So, some of the weird traits of our species, which remember, our species name is Homo sapiens, so we're in the genus Homo, and we'll talk about some of the other extinct species in the genus Homo. We're the last species left in the in our own genus, and we'll talk about one other genus, the Australopithecines. We have the largest animal brain for our body size. The only ones that are even close is dolphins. Their brain size is almost as big as ours, which is one of the reasons why people are researching them for intelligence. We're the only bipedal, truly bipedal mammal. There are a couple of other bipedal mammals like kangaroos, but they use their tails kind of like a third leg. We're certainly the only fully bipedal primate. We are mostly hairless, unlike almost every other mammal. The other mammals, there's a few other mostly hairless mammals or completely hairless mammals like whales, naked mole rats, but most mammals are covered with fur or hair, and we are not. We're the only primate that sweats a lot. Sweat helps you cool when you're exercising or exerting yourself in hot temperatures. There are other mammals that sweat, like horses, for example, but we're the only primate that does so, and this trait is actually kind of rare among mammals. We have a unique foot shape for a primate. All the rest of the primates have an opposable big toe that acts, so their feet act like hands when they're climbing. So they kind of have four hands when they're climbing. So our foot shape is unique. There's really isn't another animal that has a foot shape like ours. We're the only animal that cooks our food routinely. And it turns out that's not just our species, but some of our ancient ancestors in our genus, some of the extinct other species in our genus also routinely used fire and cooked their food. So this is very unusual trait and unique in animals. We have the most complex language, although other animals have some rudimentary vocal communication. Monkeys have a few words that they use to communicate, to indicate different types of predators. They use different vocalizations for a sky predator like an eagle, or a ground predator like a leopard, or a tree predator like a snake, to warn others. And there's a few other examples like that among animals of using different vocalizations to mean different things like words. Uh, we have the most complex tool making technology, although we are not the only tool makers. This used to be a big topic of debate among anthropologists, is when during the course of evolution did we become tool makers, because we thought our species were the only tool makers, but now we know, in fact, chimpanzees make tools. Um, there are some birds that make tools. So our common ancestor with chimpanzee probably also could make tools. So using tools and making tools are different. Many animals use tools, including almost all primates. If you pick up a rock and use it to smash a nut, that's using a tool. If you take a rock and chip it to make it into a better tool, that's making a tool. And the list of animals that make tools is very, very short, and but does include chimpanzees making tools. We certainly have the most complex culture. We have things like music and art, which just aren't present in any other species, not even in chimpanzees, although there are animals, including most primates, that pass on learned skills to their offspring. like where to find water holes during the dry season, where certain trees are that at certain times of year have types of fruit that we like to eat. So there is passed on knowledge, and that's what culture is. Culture is things that are taught to the offspring rather than being inherited by DNA. Things that are taught and passed on generation to generation. That's culture. And there's little bits of culture in some other species like elephants and other primates. We also have female menopause, which is a highly unusual trait in mammals. There's only, I think, 2 other mammal species other than our species. No other primates have menopause. So menopause means that females stop being reproductive but continue to live. And that is very unusual. Like among chimpanzees, chimpanzees have a lifespan of about 45 to 50. They are fertile and reproductive until the year that they die of old age. So there have been female chimpanzees in zoos who have had a baby at age 45 or something, and then the next year die of old age. So having a cessation of fertility and then continuing to live for several decades is highly unusual. And this evolved by natural selection. So therefore it has a function. It has a selective value. It was selected for in our ancestors because it increased their reproduction. It increased the number of offspring. So how does a non-reproductive individual increase the number of offspring? So we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to the populations chapter at the very, or the conservation chapter at the very end when we talk about human population, because it's a very interesting story. Another mammal that has female menopause are orcas, killer whales. There are non-reproductive older females who live for several decades and don't reproduce, and they are extremely valuable. And it's been shown that where there is a non-reproductive adult orca, that her grandchildren and great-grandchildren are much more likely to survive, to reproduce themselves. So that's something that could be selected for by natural selection. So what do we know about our species? So our species, which we call modern humans, because there's a lot of extinct humans. And so when I say extinct humans, I mean other species of humans, not dead members of our species. So our species has been around for a relatively short time, about 250,000 years. This has recently been pushed back from 200,000 years, and there are some who are arguing for 300,000 years, but evidence is still pending on that. Some anthropologists argue that behaviorally modern humans with music and art and clothing and all the whole thing have only been around for about 50,000 years. This is called by anthropologists the Great Leap Forward. Suddenly, 50,000 years ago, new artifacts appear in association with remains of our species. New weapons are invented, like the bow and arrow and other projectile weapons. Decorations like jewelry and tattoos become evident. Musical instruments, the oldest musical instruments are about this old. So did something happen in our evolution 50,000 years ago that is not recorded in skeletal remains? Something perhaps in the brain that was a most recent step in our evolution. Other anthropologists argue that the Great Leap Forward is nothing but an artifact of the fact that the more recent remains there are, the more likely lots of different objects are going to be preserved. And so there are some that claim that there was no Great Leap Forward. Instead, the reason we suddenly have a lot more different kinds of artifacts from 50,000 years ago and more recently is simply because it's more recent. And this is a continuing argument among anthropologists. But it is interesting that for most of human history, we don't find all of the things that would come to be associated with our species. So 50,000 years ago, there was this explosion of new artifacts and cave art and decorated clothing and a lot of regional variation in artifacts. There was a huge migration out of Africa around 50,000 years ago. So one of the things that we do know is our species originated in Africa, and we'll talk about some of the evidence for that. Our species originated in Africa, was only found in Africa for the first at least 100 to 150,000 years that our species existed. We were only in Africa. And then somewhere between 50 and 100,000 years ago, we started to migrate out of Africa and across Asia, across Europe, and then eventually to North and South America and across all of the islands in the Pacific. So, but DNA has confirmed that in fact, we are, all humans living today are a single species. We are a single interbreeding population that is very closely related. The earliest primates were very much like lemurs today. And primates first appear in the fossil record not too long after the dinosaurs go extinct. So the dinosaurs went extinct about 65 million years ago. There were a lot of mammals around at the time, but no primates. And it took a few million years for the first primates to appear in the fossil record. And the first primates were arboreal, which means they lived in trees, so they were climbing. So they had grasping fingers and toes. And they were nocturnal. So how do we know they were nocturnal if they're all extinct? Well, from the size of their eyes. So generally, animals that have huge eyes tend to be nocturnal because if your retina is very large, it can collect more light and give you better night vision. So tree-dwelling, nocturnal, small, grasping fingers and toes. And then eventually they developed a fully opposable thumb. The very early primates, however, did not have an opposable thumb. Instead, they had grasping fingers, but the thumb did not oppose the fingers. But it does for almost all primates today. Another critical evolutionary event was the development of binocular vision. So binocular vision means that the fields of vision overlap to a great extent. Our eyes face front, so do all other primates. Eyes face front. This gives us depth perception, which you probably found out the hard way if you've ever had to have one eye patched for some reason. Because of an injury or something. If you get a scratch cornea, sometimes they'll patch your eye while it heals. You totally lose your depth perception if you only have one eye. And many mammals have their eyes on the side of their head, and they have excellent peripheral vision, but because their fields of vision don't overlap, they have terrible depth perception. So why did these arboreal early primates need depth perception? Well, they were living in trees and probably leaping from branch to branch, and depth perception would be really advantageous in that regard. Notice even squirrels, who are prey animals, and they're rodents, so their eyes are mostly on the sides of their head, but they're actually more to the front than most other rodents because of that, because it gives them depth perception. Monkeys are probably the most familiar primates to us other than ourselves. And monkeys live in very complex social groups. They have large brains for a mammal. And we now know that large brains and being social go together. So the mammals that have the largest brains are the mammals that live in social groups because they're using that large brain to keep track of social relationships. Who will share food with me? Who bit me last week and I should stay away from them? Keeping track of all these different social relationships takes a big brain. Monkeys are divided into two big groups, New World monkeys and Old World monkeys. So New World is North and South America. Old World is everything else. New World monkeys split off from the primate tree much earlier than Old World monkeys. And so New World monkeys have a little bit more unusual traits. Some of them have a prehensile tail, which acts like a fifth hand. And they tend to have a flatter, kind of cuter face. These are capuchin monkeys from Central America. And old world monkeys tend to have a longer snout and look more, they call it a more dog-like face. It's not as flat. This is a baboon from Africa. So, and they don't have, none of them have prehensile tails. So if you're looking at a monkey in the zoo and you want to try to guess, is it an old world or a new world monkey, see if you can figure it out before you look at the sign. Do they have a kind of a flat, cute face? Then they're probably a New World monkey. Apes and us are in the group, the hominoids. Apes are closer to us than monkeys. The ape branched off of the primate family tree about 12, no, longer than that, 12 to 18 million years ago, I think it is. And apes there aren't very many species of apes, fewer than 20, I think is the total number of species of apes, including us. Apes tend to have larger bodies. Apes all have no tail, like we don't have a tail either. A larger brain relative to body size, which means that they're able to keep track of complex social relationships, because that's what most mammals are doing with their big brains. And this includes gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, and also gibbons. Gibbons is the one that when you see a gibbon, you think, is that a monkey? What is that? Because they're smaller. They're the smallest of the apes. And DNA now has shown that, as Darwin thought, Darwin was the first one to say back in the 1850s that chimpanzees were our closest cousin because of just from morphology, just from the shape of the bones in the skull. He said chimpanzees were our closest relative, and DNA has proven that to be correct. Our DNA is 98% identical to chimpanzees, and a lot of what that 2% that's different is doing, it's regulating genes that are in the brain. Some of that 2% difference has to do with immune system genes, and some of it has to do with brain genes, which that would surprise us. That's probably one of our biggest differences with chimpanzees is our huge size of our brain, which is more than twice the size of a chimpanzee brain. So one of the debates in anthropology, so Darwin was the first one who proposed that humans evolved by natural selection from an ape-like ancestor and that our closest cousins were chimpanzees. However, during Darwin's lifetime, there were no intermediate fossils, which used to be called the missing link. And Darwin predicted that such fossils would be found, and he was absolutely right about that. And so one of the debates, lack of fossil evidence for a long time, was which happened first, big brain or walking on two legs? And there were two hypotheses. One hypothesis was that the brain increased in size first, and then we started making tools, and then we needed to carry the tools, and so that led to walking on two legs. That was one hypothesis. The other hypothesis was that both evolved at the same time, that we slowly started walking on two legs as we slowly got a bigger and bigger brain, and then finally we ended up with the genus Homo, with fully bipedal, big brain species who were hunting and living in tribal groups and all, primitive humans. And it turned out that both hypotheses were wrong, as often happens in science. Can you tell that I kind of like it when the hypotheses are wrong? And this shows how science works too. When we have to discard, there's two competing hypotheses. We have to throw them both away because the data showed that they were both wrong. And in fact, what happened was walking upright came first. And in fact, we end up with our early Australopithecines. So Australopithecus is another genus, the genus that immediately preceded the genus Homo. And the early Australopithecines, we have a fully bipedal, upright walking ape that has a brain that's about the size of a chimpanzee. So both hypotheses were wrong. Walking upright came first. So why? What drove the evolution of this bipedal walking? Which, other apes can kind of walk on two legs for a little while, and often they will walk on two legs for short distances if they're carrying something, or sometimes even just to show off, they'll walk around on two legs for a while. So what drove the evolution of the bone changes that had to occur to make us fully bipedal? And it's now, the hypothesis is that it was for energy efficient walking. When our ancestors, the Australopithecines, first evolved into this fully bipedal ape, what was happening in Africa at that time where they lived? It was a drying environment. The trees and the forests were receding, and grassland was taking over. So there were these forest fragments separated by huge areas of grassland without much food on them for a primate. So energy efficient walking is the hypothesis, and it has been tested experimentally, and I'll tell you about one of those experiments that was really cool. So the two genuses that we're going to talk about are our own genus of Homo and the genus that immediately preceded the genus Homo. So our genus evolved from the genus Australopithecus. And you'll notice that both of these are in italics, and they're capitalized because that's what we do with the genus. The genuses are always in italics, and they're always capitalized, even if they're in the middle of a sentence. These footprints here, I'll show you another picture of them in a second. These are the famous Laetoli fossilized footprints, the first footprints of that were discovered of fully upright walking in one of our ancestors. And these were kind of a bombshell in anthropology when they were discovered in the 1960s. Okay, so in an experiment to test the energy efficient walking hypothesis, at a university, they trained chimpanzees to voluntarily walk on a treadmill. They were probably giving them treats. I don't know what's a treat for a chimpanzee, although they do tend to like all of our junk food. They like French fries and candy and all the things that we like, although it's not good for them either. So they trained chimpanzees to walk on four legs, which is quadrupedally, which they walk that way a lot. They knuckle walk. They put the pressure on their knuckles and knuckle walk. That's kind of a unique ape thing, is this knuckle walking. And they also train them to walk bipedally as well as they can, while they are being monitored for the amount of oxygen they're using and the amount of carbon dioxide they're producing. So that is how you tell how many calories are being used. And they did the same thing with humans of the same weight. And these were not athletes. These were just regular old, probably undergraduates. That's who they used for all these experiments. And they had them walk on the treadmill. And the chimpanzees used about the same amount of calories, whether they're walking on two legs or walking on four legs. The chimpanzees used about the same amount of calories. And what they discovered, though, was that their untrained, non-athlete students used about a quarter of the calories to walk the same distance. So chimpanzees use 4 times the calories to walk a mile as a human being of the same mass does. That's an incredible difference in energy efficiency. So imagine our ancestors walking long distances trying to find food. Any little bit that evolved that gave new mutations that appeared that gave individuals in that population the ability to use fewer calories to walk the same distance would have been a huge advantage. So bipedal walking is very energy efficient, especially the way that we do it. The Laetoli footprints, this is, Laetoli is the region in East Africa where these were discovered. This is an ancient volcanic ash fall. Paleontologists and anthropologists love volcanic eruptions because ash preserves fossils amazingly well, even trace fossils, which is what footprints are, and we can date it. volcanic eruptions, lava and ash from volcanic eruptions. It's one of the things we can date really precisely. So we love it. So these fossil footprints, which you can see here, there's an adult walking and a child walking right next to them. And this ash fall happened about 3.7 million years ago from a volcanic eruption. And an adult and a child walk through it. And what's hard to see in this kind of low-res image here is that the big toe is in line with the rest of the foot. So our unique foot shape had already evolved at this point, 3.7 million years ago. And the species believed to have made these footprints is a very widespread species, which was around at this time in the same area, which we have many bones from, Australopithecus afarensis. And these are the oldest bipedal prints, but obviously walking bipedally was completely in place already at this point, which means that it was evolving for millions of years before that. So the Australopithecines, fully bipedal, but with a pretty small brain, a brain barely larger than a chimpanzee. So if we look at the increase in brain size versus the evolution of bipedalism. So here's our different species along the x-axis here. We have all the way back here 5 million years ago. This is our ancestor had already split off from the chimpanzees 5 million years ago. So here we have an ape-like ancestor that has a chimp-sized brain and is not bipedal at all. And bipedalism starts to evolve, being driven by this need for energy efficient walking due to drying conditions in Africa. Brain barely changes in size, however. And then we get to the first Australopithecines about 3 million years ago, when we have several species of Australopithecus around, and we now have bipedalism pretty much just like we have today. The legs were still a little bit shorter than our legs, which is why the line isn't fully up here yet, because apes tend to have long arms and shorter legs. So Australopithecus was still like that. Shorter legs, longer arms, but walking bipedally as their main mode of transportation, small brain. Then we get to the first member of our genus, Homo habilis, about 2.4 million years ago, and we still have brain is barely bigger than the chimpanzee brain, but fully bipedal. Fully bipedal, if you saw one of these individuals walking down the street, the only thing you would notice about them was that their head was shaped kind of weird. They're walking just like us. And another interesting thing that happens around this time is the very noticeable increase in brain size up to modern brain size. So what is the driving force here? What has happened here? We already are fully bipedal. What is the driving force here? And the diet changes at this time, and this is when probably most of the evolution of our intestinal tract happened as well, because our intestines are much shorter than our ape ancestor. Which means it uses far less energy. The intestinal tract uses an enormous amount of energy. If we can shrink that by eating different foods, eating more nutrient-dense foods like more animals, that's going to allow that energy to be diverted from digestion to the brain. And that is believed to be the driving force here to increasing brain size, is the availability on the open grasslands where there's really not a lot of plants for a primate to eat, because we're not ruminants. We can't digest grass like cows can, and all the other, gazelles, antelopes, giraffe, all those kind of animals. So more nutrient-dense food is what drove the increase in brain size until we get to modern size and shape of species in our genus. So a lot of skeletal changes had to occur. So besides the arm and leg length, the differences that I just mentioned, so comparing chimpanzees to the Australopithecines, they still had kind of short legs, But now the arms are getting shorter. Arms are getting shorter, legs are getting a little bit longer. But the biggest difference with the legs was how they're oriented during bipedal walking. When chimpanzees walk bipedally, their knees bow out and their feet point out. When humans walk, and Australopithecines as well, as we can see from those Laetoli footprints, the feet were lined up together. This is far more energy efficient to walk this way, with knees pointing forward, feet pointing forward. This required a change in the hips. So our hip bone is a different shape, partially to accommodate that femur attachment so that our legs could move differently, but also partially to lend support to the abdominal cavity, because once you're walking fully upright, the organs now need to be supported because gravity is now in this direction, and those things need to be supported. So we ended up with what we call a bowl-shaped pelvis instead of a long, skinny pelvis like it is in all of the rest of the primates. Another big change is where the skull attaches. And this is one of the ways we can tell whether a species was bipedal if all we have is the skull, because the skull is one of the hardest bones, so it's the most likely to be preserved. So we have a lot of specimens where we have the skull or pieces of the skull and nothing else from the rest of the body. So how do you know if they were bipedal? Well, in a bipedal animal, where the spine attaches to the skull is going to be underneath. If you have an animal that's primarily quadrupedal, where the skull attaches to the spine is going to be in the back. So that attachment point had to move during the evolution leading up to the Australopithecines. We also have an S-curve in our spine. Almost all the rest of the mammals have a kind of a straight or sometimes even a C-shaped spine. This lumbar curve, that curve in at the base of our spine, is a shock absorber that allows us to walk, because walking bipedally is more impactful because you only have one foot hitting the ground at a time. It's more jarring. So this S-curve in our spine, it flexes when we walk, and that provides a little bit of cushioning to our head so that we're not jarred as much. And if you've never been aware of how jarring walking bipedally is, if you've ever had a back injury, oh, walking can be really painful, and you really feel that jarring motion of walking bipedally. Our hands and feet shape also changed. So on the left here, this is a chimpanzee hand, and this is a human hand. And you'll notice the palm is much longer here, the fingers are longer, and the thumb is smaller. So although they have an opposable thumb, ours is much more proportional to the rest of the hand. So this hand is for tree climbing, and our hands are not. And we can still climb trees, but we're not as good at it as chimpanzees are. So, and another difference is finger dexterity. So chimpanzees can't move all their fingers independently. They can do this, and they can point at things, but they can't move each finger independently the way that we can. We have much greater finger dexterity. So, you know, we can do this. Chimpanzee couldn't do that. We can do this. You know, chimpanzees can't do that. They don't have fully independent movement of these three fingers. That's one of the reasons it's really hard to teach them human sign language. People have taught several chimpanzees and a couple of gorillas human sign language, but the signs don't look like the signs that humans make. A 3-year-old human child can sign better than a chimpanzee can sign, and that's because they just don't have the finger dexterity. These three fingers tend to move together for chimpanzees, so we couldn't teach him to play the piano either. So, and our feet, here's a human foot, chimpanzee foot, and all primates have this except us, an opposable big toe that acts like an opposable thumb, obviously for climbing. And they're much better at climbing than we are. So what is our foot adapted for? Well, we have this energy efficient bipedal gait. and sweating and hairlessness go along with that. Remember, we evolved in equatorial Africa, so it's hot where we evolved. And what good did sweating and hairlessness do us out on this open grassland? Well, the current hypothesis is that it allowed us to pursue prey. Because most of the animals that we would have been eating as Australopithecines um, don't have this ability and must rest during the hottest part of the day. And really, although they're way faster than us, we can keep chasing them for a very long time. So I have a little video here that is a little BBC video of persistence hunting, and it's a little cheesy, but it's the way that they came up with the persistence hunting hypothesis was actually by talking to these members of the San people who live in the country of South Africa today and a few neighboring countries like Botswana, and ask them, if you didn't have rifles or projectile weapons, if all you had were stabbing spears and rocks, how could you hunt large game? And they said, oh, we'll show you. You know, you just chase them until they're exhausted, they get heat stroke and collapse, and then you can just hit them on the head. So that's what they demonstrated. All right, so in the next video, let's talk about some of the different species that are extinct, members of Australopithecines and our genus of Homo.